So what I want to do is
British had a paper there.
give people an idea on how this movement changed and changes history. Some people here are familiar with that, but it's not simple, it's complex. It's simple at a certain level, and this is the level that it's simple on, even though it's profound. I don't know how many people have read either the first autobiography of LaRouche, which was written in 1976, called The Power of Reason, and then there was a second one he wrote in '88 called The Power of Reason, 1988. So as somebody recently said, it's not called The Power of $87 trillion. It's not called The Power of Huge Armies that can, or The Power of Nuclear Weapons. It's called The Power of Reason. And there's a reason it's called The Power of Reason. And what I want to go through, and this is somewhat autobiographical on my part, because we're now coming up on the 25th anniversary of my personal involvement in bringing these ideas of LaRouche into the Chinese-speaking world on this planet, which started, and people here may remember, June 4th, 1989, Tiananmen Square. How many of you people remember? That's 25 years ago, this coming June 4th. That's the anniversary. You want to feel old, I want to start with this. This is something that LaRouche used to use a lot when he was building the movement in the 1970s, from Shelley's Defense of Poetry, where Shelley says, "The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and imparting intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The person in whom this power resides may often, as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve that power which is seated upon the throne of their own soul." You can all think about that. All right. So you got to look at some of these things. Okay, this is the latest coming out of mainland China. They've announced that they want to build the 8,000-mile rail link from what essentially is Siberia to the Bering Strait, and then they want to build the tunnel. Right? So this is just, a couple of weeks ago they announced this. And this is what the subject is of these discussions with Russia and China that are ongoing now. They're making a whole series of agreements for massive development of northeastern China, Siberia, and Russia, which is the same thing, right?
Well, what's that? I'm sorry. What's that on the right side? The picture of a car washed out?
This is an article. China, it's just an article, and they have a picture of some high-speed trains. This is a schematic of the tunnel that will go under the Bering Straits. No cars. The cars have to go on the trains, but there are two tubes, and then you have an electrical tube. So that would be the idea. This is, it's not, this could be done. I mean, we could start this tomorrow.
We should have had that in America, but China's smart.
Well, this is an American schematic. There's a whole website that was set up by a Russian friend of ours, which is all in English, which you can look at. You can find the name. But anyway, you have to ask yourself, what's going on here? I mean, this is something that Seward envisioned in the 1850s. Because it's a little teeny 50 miles between Alaska and Russia. Hey, if we can get a bridge there or somewhere, even transit. If we had rail lines that went to each side, you could even do portage or something. And this is a way to link up the two. I mean, anybody that's thinking about development of civilization would be thinking about this. So why are the Chinese doing this, right? This is a recent I guess it was a month ago, April. This is as far as I can tell, it's one of the most popular English language talk shows. Remember Ted Koppel? It's like Ted Koppel, right? Except it's a weekly thing.
There was a nightline on Channel 7 maybe.
Yeah, every night, yeah. And anyway, this is the Chinese Central, the government television station, CCTV. And they had held the LaRouche on, which he was there recently. And you can see what it says. Silk Road for the 21st Century, exclusive interview. exclusive interview with the new Silk Road lady. So this is something. So here's Helga Zepp LaRouche. And she is known internationally. You want to talk about the Eurasian Lambert, new Silk Road? She's the Silk Road lady. And this remember, China is a pretty controlled place. So this is the CCTV, is the government. So it's a very clear statement they're making. You want to know anything about this, here's the person to address. So again, you have to ask yourself, how did that happen? Right? This is an earlier interview last summer with Linden, also Xinhua, which is the official Chinese government press agency. And this is it's a whole series of questions. What about Obama, impeachment, the British, we just go through one by one. This is last summer. And this is, I love this. This is Baidu. Baidu is the Chinese language version of Google, even though you can Google in Chinese, but there's this is their search engine for the Chinese language world. And if you type in LaRouche's name, you get, right? And now this says, it's 109,000 hits. I didn't go through, look at all 109,000 hits, but I went through and paged through several hundred. When I got to like 700 or 800 or something, it's not like it's a mistake. It's still articles pertaining to LaRouche. And these are everything you could possibly imagine. These are our strategic analysis, interviews with LaRouche, some scholar in some university somewhere writing some treatise on economics and saying, as the American economist LaRouche says, blah, 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 blah. Pretty amazing. So you have to ask yourself again, how in the hell did this happen? You remember, this is the oldest continuous culture on the planet and the largest number of people on the planet. It's not a small thing, right? So what I want to do is just kind of take you back and just look at this, because it's really quite fascinating. So we'll go back to 1979. And there's two things kind of intersecting that are going on at that point. China's coming out of the Cultural Revolution, which is an absolute nightmare. And I'll show a video clip, and it'll give you a very, very sensuous idea of what this was and what happened. It was like the Nazi period in Germany. So you had, in '79, the trip by Isaac Stern, the American violinist, to China to begin to open up. And this was at the behest of these circles around this fellow, Deng Xiaoping, who was against the Maoists and the radicals, etc. And the second thing was, in 1980, I believe it was, you had the first trip, as far as I know, of representatives of LaRouche, EIR, to Beijing. Now, I couldn't tell you the content of those discussions. There was a little article that we wrote up in 1980, which is what this is, but it doesn't say anything about the discussions. What I do know is that immediately following that, we published this, I think, in 81, 82. It's called a 50-year development policy for the Indian Pacific Ocean Basin. And it laid out a whole plan of these great projects through the Pacific Basin. And there's a whole section in there which is a very cautious and diplomatic address by LaRouche personally to the Chinese government. We invite you to be part of this. We know you've gone through these crises recently, et cetera, because under Mao, China was not exactly a nice place to be, right? Or a nice government to deal with. Note that they're involved with all sorts of filthy things. So this is an opening by LaRouche saying, hey, you can be part of this under my understanding of what economics is and what the American system is. I mean, this is 1982, right? So let's look at this. Have anybody ever seen this, the Mao to Mozart documentary? Eugene, you must have seen this.
Mao to Mozart.
This is Isaac Stern's visit to China, the documentary.
Remember?
No, I didn't see that.
Okay, so let's look at this, and you'll get a very, very good idea.
There's not much chance to hear famous musicians during this last 10 years or more. Isaac Stern's visit to China has made a deep impression among the Chinese musicians. Mr. Stern discovered when the older students play Beethoven or Mozart or some things which are more delicate, more sophisticated, they don't understand the music very much. just play the notes. Most of the students want to play something difficult. Everything must be fast, loud, noisy. They think that if they can play something difficult and fast, they can get a good job. Everyone will get a job after graduation, but some jobs are better than others. So everybody strives to play something difficult to show that I'm the best player. Mr. Stern stressed more on music than on technique. He emphasized that technical excellence alone is not enough. The mind must be free to create what the composer had in mind.
See, there must always be life to every note.
每个音符都要有生命的。
There is not a single casual note in music. There's not an, that every note has a reason. You're a very musical boy.
你是很乐感的。
Why don't you do what your heart tells you to do, what your ear tells you to do?
为什么你不照你的心、你的耳朵叫你做的那样去拉呢？
You're having the conversation. You're
你
saying,
在说话呀，
you know, it's not just
不是这样的。
Thank
Very, very high standard.
非常高水
On
平，
any international level.
从国际
It's
上
a very, very, very high standard.
水平很高。
From what we have seen, you have an extraordinary power in China available to you and your young people. But both Mr. Golub and I have reached the same conclusion all the way through from everything we've heard, that the young people, 8, 9, 10, 11, remarkable. But 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, something happens to them. What happened in between?
再往大了以后啊，这个孩子就好像有点什么问题存在，到底是怎么回事儿？
那么有一批小学生，像他，我这个学生，他是从小学出来的，可是他念到中学、高中1年级，文化大革命就来了。
Well, originally, the graduates of the conservatory were all taken from the graduates of the primary and middle schools attached to the conservatory. For instance, Ms. Tang Yun, she was a graduate of the primary school of this conservatory before. But when she reached the age of 18 or 19, there came to be the Cultural Revolution, and these activities, these teachings were stopped. You could see that many of the young people of 18 or 19 years old, they have gone through this period, and during that period, nothing was taught, and it was quite difficult for them to continue with their study. So the level, yeah,
Couldn't even
the
play.
level today they can present.
Listen to the a record of the classical music. It is originally
The crowd.
the crime.
他中学念完以后，
Cultural revolution, in their terms, was an attempt to change the cultural format of the country into a closed, inward-looking society that rejected any influence, acceptance, recognition of any foreign influence.
For them to reach such a level is already very difficult because they've gone through such a difficult period.
现在我已经开放了。
The Cultural Revolution started during the spring of 1966. All of a sudden, in May, the storm broke out. I taught Beethoven, Mozart, Western music. I taught people to make violins. Those are the instruments belonging to the imperialists, belonging to the foreign devils, belonging to the Westerners. It was like a bad dream, like nightmare. I was confined to a small room. That's not a room, that's a closet in the basement of the library, just under the stairs. It's a small closet, without window, without light, without ventilation, and there is a septic tank under the floor, and a big pipe. The refuse comes from the toilets through that pipe into the septic tank, and smells very badly. I had to stay there for 14 months. And because the lack of oxygen, lack of air, my legs were swollen. I think the chief reason they did that to all the professors and teachers is just to get rid of us because they want to get power, to get control of the conservatory, to get control of the music. But during a period, I was not allowed to come out. I had to stay in the dark room all the time. Somebody would send me something to eat. I was allowed to come out for a few minutes every day to get a little water, to go to the toilet. And once my daughter came from Peking, she wanted to see me. And the Red Guard told me, your daughter wants to see you, but I allow you only 5 minutes to talk with her, and with his presence. So it was in the evening. He led me to a corner of the wall, and I saw my daughter in the dark with a granddaughter of 7 years. When I saw my granddaughter called me grandfather. I couldn't restrain my tears because I was treated as a criminal. Sometimes we were treated as animals. Ten of our teachers died by suicide because they couldn't stand the humiliation and torture, especially the torture of the mind and the humiliation. Of course, we were beaten, we were kicked and beaten in many ways, but I think that's all right comparing with the humiliation. We were treated as criminals because we taught them Western music.
All for promoting classical music. Wow.
What?
All that punishment for promoting classical music.
I'm sorry, all is what?
All that punishment just for promoting classical music.
Yeah, especially them. He was the head, that man was the head of the Shanghai Conservatory of Music, which was the premier cultural center at that point in China.
What was that? And the picture, Isaac, what, Stewart?
Stern.
Isaac Stern?
Yeah, you can Google it and find some of his recordings. So, what you have then, of course, is LaRouche is quite early on in the late 70s in a certain dialogue with certain scientific layers in Russia and elements tied to the American military, kind of picking up on the old FDR and Kennedy tradition of ending this whole thermonuclear nightmare, and then restoring the natural historic alliance between the United States and Russia for development. It goes all the way back to the revolution. So you have on the one side the MAD doctrine, everybody remember that, mutually assured destruction, Henry Kissinger, right? And LaRouche's proposal, which was the Strategic Defense Initiative, which Reagan, because he was an old FDR guy, which is what he was an FDR Democrat in Hollywood, right? Turned Republican for whatever reason. But Reagan got the idea and he went with it. And of course, by that point, what occurred is that there was agreement among certain Russians that they would collaborate with the United States on this. The British intervened and overthrew the Gromyko government, put in Andropov, who was a total British tool in charge of the Soviet Union. The British essentially ensured that the leadership of the Soviet Union would not accept LaRouche's offer. Okay, that's the short version.
And that was Andropov?
Andropov, yeah. Andropov, however you want to pronounce it. But this, so LaRouche said, well, he said, if you guys don't go with this, the Soviet Union will collapse within 5 years. He said in 1983. Something else occurred then, in 1983-84, 1984 specifically, which was the founding of the International Schiller Institute, which is an idea of Helga LaRouche to take the best of European culture, namely Schiller, and reunite the alliance of that with the tradition of the American Revolution, which is really all the same thing. And the first international conference was on July 3rd, July 4th. That'll be 30 years, this July 3rd and 4th. And then in November, we had another second international conference, and we drew up the Declaration of Inalienable Rights of Man. And this is an historic document, because you had representatives from countries all over the world, and it's basically the Declaration of Independence for the entire planet. Every nation has a right to these inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of property through the sovereign development of nation states, and we have all these people who have signed it. All right, so it's quite something. So that set into motion a global process where we would fight on every single terrain that was necessary to secure that. Yeah.
You said the pursuit of property.
No, I didn't say that. I said happiness.
Yeah, but you said property.
No, I said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I would never say property. That's a Confederate thing. Okay, and then as part of this, something else was going on. That's too bad Howard Giske isn't. Here's Howard Giske. This is 1985. And Phil Rubenstein launched a campaign for mayor of New York City against Koch. And the whole focus was, is the enemy operation, of course, inside the United States was, as it is today, London and Wall Street. Specifically the drug money laundering, which was exploding at that point in the 1980s, through Wall Street. And so the whole campaign of Koch was, this is the doping candidate. Don't let Koch needle you, right? Because they were handing out free needles. You remember that? They had a whole plan. That was their way to stop the drugs, hand out free needles to all the heroin heads.
Makes that AIDS.
Yeah, right, and kill people. So, and as part of this, we had a whole expose as part of the campaign of the drug money laundering of the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. That's how we used to call it then back in 1985. We call it the Hong Kong Shanghai Bank. And now it's HSBC, and nobody knows what that even means, right? So, but anyway, so that was a very high profile case. And what happened is, and this shows you how the universe actually works. What happened is a group of people in Chinatown immediately, this enamored them. This really got them going because they were in some, which we had no idea, they were involved in some local battle of Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation or something like it, taking over certain things in China. I don't even remember what it was. So they were hot on this idea, right? And we ran into this fellow here. His name is Justin Yu, who was actually, Eugene Chun is his Chinese name. He was actually a pretty well-known journalist in the Chinese-speaking world out of Taiwan, right? Not mainland China. And this is their meet. They have it's called the Chinese Community Benevolent Association on Mott Street. I don't know if anybody's ever been there, right? Yeah. So Phil and Lady Rubenstein got involved in a whole discussion with Justin on the issue of LaRouche. And Justin was part of a bigger operation centered in Taipei in Taiwan, in the Republic of China, and they had a magazine called the China Flag Monthly. And they kind of considered themselves the old traditional Kuomintang in the tradition of Sun Yat-sen, Chinese patriots. And there were still a bunch of them still alive then, right? So in 1988, Lynn and Helga had an historic visit to Taiwan where they had a press conference. They addressed a whole grouping of kind of the elite of the Republic of China, legislators, and then some of the old military people, this guy, General Teng Che. Right? So this is the first direct contact that Lyndon, as far as I know, has in the Chinese-speaking world. But you see how it all developed, out of the campaign in the streets of New York. And then, of course, you had the famous October 1988 speech by LaRouche was then in West Berlin, at the Kempinski Hotel. saying now is the time because of what I forecast, the imminent collapse of the Soviet Union. Now is the time for a reunified Germany. Of course, we were all like, what is he talking about? I mean, the way I grew up is the Berlin Wall was like the Wall of Adrian or something. It was never going to go away, or the Great Wall of China or something. You just kind of like got used to it. So I thought it was really neat and everything, but it was like, what are the chances of this ever happening, right? And then, of course, he knew, because he is the architect of the SDI, that there's an internal process going on within Comecon, the communist countries, which is leading to its rapid collapse. And that the danger is these governments would turn into total dictatorial governments to try to maintain their power by crushing the people. And so a month after he was in Berlin, he issued this call, which went out around the world, which is a call for a worldwide anti-Bolshevik resistance struggle against this, what would be these kind of dictatorial, crackdowns in the East, all right? And he says, using Schiller's William Tell, let us swear the Rootly Oath from William Tell. Let it be made clear that whatever the communist imperial interest shall destroy, that wherever shall destroy governments or subvert them to such a degree that they become virtually pro-Soviet varieties of Quisling rule, which so cease treasonously to be lawful authority, the new resistance shall launch what modern China's experience defines as people's war against the communists and their accomplices. And I'll just remind you, the Cultural Revolution in China is one such example of probably one of the worst, of this kind of brutal suppression. And there's no difference between that, fascism, you can call it anything you want to. It's oligarchical suppression of the human mind. So that's November 14th, 1988. And within a few months, Lyndon LaRouche was taken off to prison. Okay? This is after a few years of massive attacks on our association and him personally. And then a railroad of LaRouche and 5 associates to federal prison in January of 1989. And I'll never forget this. I mean, for all of us, it was just, it was unbelievable. And a lot of us, this was so horrible. This great man just being treated like a criminal, thrown into prison. We figured, okay, within a month, maybe a few weeks, there's going to be an explosion, and he'll be out, And, we contacted church layers and old civil rights layers, and, had people go down to Virginia and
Amnesty International.
What's that?
Amnesty International.
Yeah, all sorts of, well, that was later. That was actually as part of the drive to get him out of prison after what. In other words, the way I thought about it, and I think a lot of people thought about it, is that this was just so horrible. They were going to let him out. You can't let this stand. And, so you get January, then February, and then March, and then April, and it's clearly not going to happen. And I can tell you, this is a dark moment for a lot of us. And then something happened in the world, which is absolutely phenomenal, which broke out in May and June of 1989, which was thousands and thousands of these young people, students, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, poured into the square of Tiananmen. This is the center of Beijing, right? And they had they had a slogan, freedom, and they erected a mock Statue of Liberty. That was their symbol, modeled on the United States Statue of Liberty. And their anthem was the Beethoven's Ode to Joy. So we look at this, we're all sitting there depressing, oh my God, it's over, LaRouche is in jail, forget about it. And then this explodes, and we were like, wow, where did this come from? Now I have to remind you about something that's interesting to think about. I have these pictures here. These are the kids in the Isaac Stern video. That's the age of by 1989, 10 years after Isaac Stern's visit, of the young people, or of that generation that he's talking about, were the ones that are receptive to the music because they didn't go through the Cultural Revolution. And that became the generation of the Tiananmen Square. Right? So this created great hope and optimism in our ranks, and I think in a lot of other ranks, that this resistance that LaRouche had called for a couple months before he himself was thrown in prison, actually had a life, right? This is a very common scene that occurred, where you had initially the military sent in, they said you got to clear the square, but then the students would organize them. And they're all Chinese, so the military wouldn't do anything. They just in fact, in many cases, in certain ways, became part of the demonstrations. People remember this.
Oh, yeah.
历史事件的含义不会自动呈现出来，而总是由人来解释的。
Did the government ever
6月5日
prosecute
清晨的这
them?
一瞬间，
Well, we'll
将
get to
成为
that.
永恒的历史象征。后来，他消失在人群中，下落不明，连姓名都
It just
没
gives the
有。
idea of the spirit.
对
Romeo,
全世界千百
I
万的
stand
电
for
视观
something
众来
greater.
说，这一时刻的含义非常清楚。这是人类良知与勇气在向无情的国家机器挑战。
And the point about it is that the guys running those tanks are not
这
going
一场面的
to.
解释同样简单，只是截然相反。
He wants to go up and start organizing them. Hey, come on out. All right, anyway, you get the idea.
Oh my God.
People remember that?
Yeah.
That was,
Yes.
people remember. Used to have posters of that.
Yeah.
So, what in fact did happen is the hardliners ended up winning the day inside mainland China, and they brought in military units from completely out of the area that had no allegiance to the local people, and they just slaughtered thousands and thousands and thousands of these students. We don't even know how many. They just ran them over with tanks and mowed them down. And so what you had is that all over the world, you had these, anywhere where there's Chinese diaspora, whether it was in New York or Australia or whatever, you had mass demonstrations in support and in honor of these martyrs of June 4th, as they were known. I think this one's in Hong Kong. Oh, that's still Tiananmen. Oh yeah, and then, I don't know where this one is. This is not, they have these vigils. Now what happened is here in New York, is you had a group of these people allied with this movement, students, Chinese students, and they set up a permanent vigil across the street from the UN, and they had a hunger strike. And the idea is that these students would be on a hunger strike until, the government in China changed. That was the idea. So we're looking at this, and we're saying, my God, I mean, these people are willing to put their lives on the line for a higher idea, for a higher cause, for a higher truth. They have to know us. They have to know LaRouche. And that was the way we thought of it. We got to get in there and give them an idea of what world they're actually living in, because they don't know about the SD. They don't know about, Russia. They don't know anything about any of these things. American history, the difference between America and Britain, blah, 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 all these things. So that's what we did. I would go over to these, rallies in front of the UN, rallies in front of the Chinese mission, right? I'd try to meet people, get contacts, find local people. One thing that we then discovered in the process of all this is we started looking into the history, because we didn't even know anything about China. Forget it. It's thousands of years of brutal tyrants and dynasties, and okay, they got some good food, but that's there's some interesting things. And so what we discovered was Sun Yat-sen, and what people may now know today, that Sun Yat-sen was a student of Lincoln's American system. He was a Hamiltonian in essence, that he had designed a whole railroad plan as part of a Eurasian land bridge, right, which he wrote up in the International Development, and this is from 1988. This is 1989. We put out a whole EIR on this, because we found the International Development of China, and we basically did a modern version of his map, right? It's phenomenal. This is the International Development of China, and then he gave a whole series of these lectures called Samin Shui, the three principles of the people. This is kind of like and these were a series of lectures to the cadre. And he got this from, let me just go back to that. This is derived from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. The government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So that's what Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles are. You can translate, this is Mingchu, which is people sovereignty of the people. Mingzu, government, people's democracy. And then this is the most important one, Mingsheng, which is livelihood. That is physical economic development, right? The development of the population and such. This is a postage stamp that was put out during World War II, which you could buy at your post office. It said letters of Lincoln and Sun Yat-sen. Of the people, by the people, for the people, and then the 3 principles here. So we didn't know any of this. This is all like, wow, you know. This is just, I wanted to just show that this is Mark Calney, who passed away a few years ago. And he started just diving into this. He discovered most of this stuff. He got direct photocopies of original documents from Hawaii, where Sun Yat-sen was, went to school. And he did all the background on this. And it never, for most Americans, knew absolutely nothing about this. So I must say, we really brought this man to life. It's just more of a... Okay, so what we did, this is the fun part. It's all fun, but we said, okay, we got to put out some kind of a publication in Chinese. We don't have any Chinese language publications. So I found these guys, these young guys, associated with something called, let's see if this is here. Oh yeah, there it is. I actually found it on Google Maps, same building. This is in East Elmhurst. And they were alive with something called the Chinese Democratic Party. This is a young guy who must have been 18 or 19 years old, and another fellow. And I would go over there, and we would write up, you know, like little articles, right? And we had someone else who was here, who we had met from Taiwan, who would translate them into Chinese in handwriting. And this is all before internet, no internet here, right? And then I would take them over, these handwritten things, and they had a computer with Chinese characters, right? And they would typeset it, and then they'd print them out. They'd print these pages out, and I would run back to our office. Do I have this? I thought I brought this with me. Oh, I guess not. Anyway, it doesn't matter. That's all. Anyway, and then I would run them off on the Xerox machine, and we'd fold them up, and that was our publication. This is a later one. This is from 1991. Right? It didn't even look that nice when we first started it. But then what we did is show you. So we made up a little subscription form, and of course at that point, again, the Chinese diaspora here in New York, like elsewhere, was up in arms about all of this. They were in tremendous political kind of upheaval. And we had also had the earlier contact with Justin going back to Phil's campaign. And we made up a subscription form, and we got someone to tell us what to put on signs. And we set up a table. And typically, this is Mott Street, right near where this would be like Canal Street. People know the area.
Right.
Benevolence Association is a little bit down here. And we set up on the corner. I remember there was a bank there, I think. And people would come up and give their $20 and sign up and subscribe to this, right? And then I'll go back to that. And then we sent this. We would print up several hundreds of these Chinese newsletters every week. First it was every week, and we sent them out to all of our different locals across the country, ultimately around the world, and the subscription form. So people in San Francisco, in Canada, would have these, and every time they'd meet someone that was Chinese, it was real political, and we found some of the best of the best this way. So what happens, of course, is that a few months following Tiananmen Massacre, you have this phenomenon that begins to explode in the East. This is East Germany. People remember the Monday night vigils in Leipzig, in Halle. And of course, we're all sitting there saying, oh my God, it's going to be Tiananmen all over again. And it almost was. And that's a whole story in and of itself. But instead of that, the Berlin Wall was torn down. Exactly as LaRouche said, it ought to be a year earlier. Although LaRouche, of course, is now in prison. Right? So this is all part of a continuous process. And we constantly were trying to get the Chinese insight that this is not some Chinese thing. Right? That there's a global historic process going on here. This is 1990. This is right here at Confucius Plaza in New York City, those big apartment buildings, if people know that. And you can see our signs. One free China, one free Germany. And then we have Lincoln, Martin Luther King, and Sun Yat-sen. That's me. That's John Basar. People remember him. Charles Hughes. He's still alive.
Yeah,
Everybody else here is dead except me.
Yeah, Charles Hughes is in the chair.
Yeah. There we go. So we had the banners up about Food for Peace. Schiller Institute, the dream is still alive. Anyway, you get the idea. Now the other side of this thing, which just blew us away, because in the 1990s, when LaRouche was in prison, if you would have called a press conference anywhere, or for anything, I'm a LaRouche candidate, forget it, nothing. You get absolutely nothing, except maybe some attacks on you in the media, right? So we called these press conferences, and we a lot of it was done through our friend Justin, but he would get the word out that we were having a press conference. All of the press would show up. And we would typically have these in China. This is a typical press conference. This one actually is in California. But it was always done in, let's have another picture here. I'll just show you, that's a good one.
Wow.
It's always done in a restaurant, and everybody said, oh, this is all media people from all the top papers. And you'd have like an hour discussion, and it would be back and forth and back and forth. But unlike any other press conference, then the next day, all of these articles would appear in the newspapers, in the printed papers. I could go down and buy one, in Manhattan, and there's a whole article about Lyndon LaRouche, and I mean, these are from later, right? This is a conference that LaRouche was part of and later on, but it was the same. Oh yeah, here's a good one. This is also later. This is a press conference that Laney and Dennis Speed did on the first, I guess it was on the first anniversary, or it was something on 9/11. It was quite controversial. We got major coverage in the Chinese newspapers on it. So we must have done, between California and New York, we must have done a couple dozen of these things. And every time, this is before internet. No Chinese people were surfing the net in 1995, okay? Very few people are, period, So this is all printed word, and LaRouche's ideas went out through the printed Chinese media. This is the first publication we put out, which was a Chinese language translation of that Pacific Basin brief I showed you earlier from 1982, inviting the Chinese to be part of these development projects. I think this was put out in, I don't know, 1991 or 2 or something like that. It was the first thing, it was a little blue book. And then we moved into the fancy version of the Chinese language EIR.
It looks just like the EIR.
Yeah, it's like a little pamphlet, right? There you go. And we then put out monthly. And this is from, this is 1995. It's called The New Silk Road, 21st Century Eurasia. In 1995, nobody's talking about a new Silk Road. This is all our idea. And there you have the whole thing. You have the whole transcontinental Eurasian land bridge. This is on the cover of our Chinese language publication. And what we consciously try to do with this is, as much as possible, give people kind of the highest ideas of Lin. So this is one of the papers that he wrote in '96 called on Artistic and Natural Beauty. Where he talks about this idea of artistic composition, and then he goes through the whole question of the C256 tuning, how it works physically. I mean, these are things, if people follow the weekly reports, you've been following some of this stuff. But this was all in Chinese. And this became one of the most popular things. There's this and another one. I don't know if I have a slide of it, which is a paper that LaRouche wrote called Who is God that man is made in his image? Right? So they really caught on to these kind of profound discussions by Lin on these most fundamental questions. This is the issue covering LaRouche's 1996 campaign for president, LaRouche's trip to Russia in 1996. So our Chinese friends can keep here. Right? And we made sure they knew all about George Bush. This is Bush. What was the name of that report? Cocaine. No. It was dope super kingpin. Cocaine kingpin, or whatever, George Bush. And this was all about the thing with the Contras and the crack that maybe some people are aware about. So it has to be clear that there's a difference between what LaRouche represents in the United States and these traditions, Kennedy, etc., and these scumbags that work for the British Empire, which is the old Opium War crowd. And that became increasingly clear to a lot of these Chinese leaders. We then did something in '96, which was quite extraordinary. We rediscovered a work that Sun Yat-sen wrote in 1917 called The Vital Problem of China. I think it was by 1925, if I have it right. I mean, the British were always, most of Sun Yat-sen's life was hiding out somewhere. At a certain point, I think it was in the 20s, maybe it was 22, they just ransacked his entire life. They just burned his library. They burned his office, his headquarters, etc. So nobody in the Chinese world knows about this. And it's an extraordinary work, because what he goes through in this document is, number one, why the Chinese should have nothing to do with World War I, and certainly not ally with the British in World War I. If anything, they should ally with Germany. And then he goes through this whole explanation of geopolitics. And I don't think there's anything in this period of history that so accurately identifies what this whole World War process is than this document that he wrote in 1917. So we found it and we reprinted it, much to the horrors of a lot of pro-Brits in the Chinese-speaking world as well as the British period. And it's an introduction by Helga LaRouche, and it has an afterword by the son of Chiang Kai-shek. Not Chiang Ching-kuo, who's kind of like the big famous guy, but Chiang Wei-kuo, who was kind of always treated as that's him. He was somewhat of a renegade. He didn't go always with the party line.
What's the name again? What's the name
Chiang
of the book?
Wei-kuo. Oh, the book is called The Vital Problem of China.
Is it English translated?
Yeah, you can get the English on our Chinese language website. You go to I have a Sun Yat-sen page on the Chinese language website, eir.chinese.com.
What comes to mind now is you didn't discuss because this is way after the Boxer Rebellion, so-called rebellion.
Well, I'm not going through that so much. That's a whole different class that I get.
Okay.
You have to look at my class from 2 years ago for that.
Yeah,
that's
of course.
So that's a whole other fact, because there's a whole background to the reason that these things are happening, which is what you're getting at.
That was the start.
But our point was to promote this, to make it absolutely clear of the difference of the British Empire system and the American system, which he understood, okay? And this is a document that LaRouche wrote in 1997 called Time to Free NATO of the Entente Cordiale. Time to free NATO of the British Empire. It's not, NATO's not a weapon of the empire.
Supposed to be.
Yeah. So again, we put this out as a major feature of LaRouche's in the newsletter. So by 1994, LaRouche is freed from prison with the intervention by President Bill Clinton. Because of a large part of LaRouche's importance as a liaison, leading American liaison with the Russians. So people remember when LaRouche came out of jail, the first conference we had was in Virginia, and the whole podium was filled with Russians. And the Russian Academy of Sciences, and they gave him an award, and it was the whole thing. And then he went to Moscow. This is Kuznetsov, who's which you can look on the website. They have the video of LaRouche's presentation to this conference that just occurred in Moscow in honor of the 90th birthday of Boris Kuznetsov, who's a great Russian scientist. But this is, of course, in 1994, 20 years ago. So Russia's going through problems then, because you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, you have the IMF pasty-faced jerks from Harvard and the London School of Economics coming in, pushing deregulation, free trade. The place is being looted to death. So we're laying out all these ideas of the Russians about the Eurasian language, and they said, look, we can't really do anything about this now. Go to China. They'll be interested. Yeah.
I know this is all true because I was into this business going to Montana, visit a friend in Glacier Park, and lo and behold, I met one of those guys who got a hold of stolen wood panels from Russia and try to sell it off.
Oh, yeah, right. That's
I said, I can't believe
yeah, it was just looted. It was looted. Yeah. Anyway, so what happens is this faction that's in China that's clearly been following us in all sorts of ways that we can't even necessarily document. But that's the power of reason. They decide they're going to have a conference on the subject of the Eurasian land bridge. And they're going to invite 2 people to speak, to give keynote speeches. Well, it's a lot more than 2 people, but in terms of foreigners, you know. Helga Zepp LaRouche, and this guy, I think it's this guy here, a British free trade advocate, Leon Britton. So it's very clear, the contrast can be very clear to the audience. And of course, Leon Britton's talking about the privatized Eurasian land bridge or some crap like this, which would obviously never work. And then of course, Helga lays out exactly the whole plan.
toll roads across Asia.
And this is another story. Well, here's another thing, right? Here's another thing. This shows you how history works. Before Helga LaRouche even knew Lyndon LaRouche, she was a young journalist student. She was one of the first Western journalists allowed into mainland China after the Cultural Revolution, which would have been 1970 or something. Well, I don't know when it was. That's not then. That's, but you know. So she had already some kind of an attachment to this culture or interest in it, right? And that's her in the 1996 trip. And this is the kind of activity. This is, I think, a later trip. I don't know if this is the 96 trip, but this is a seminar where a whole bunch of kind of these policy makers, think tank type people would gather, and there'd be in-depth discussions in terms of how this would all work. This is our Chinese newsletter version of the 1996 trip, where we have the speeches of all the different participants in it. So that went out all over the world. And then by 1997, we really honed this down in this Eurasian Land Bridge report, which I think a lot of people have seen, and we're going to now be rewriting now and updating, because now there's a whole renewed effort to, as you can see by the Bering Straits tunnel issue, and et cetera, to get this done. I want to just show this because this is something that LaRouche was directly involved in. I just happen to know it because I happen to know it. But so this is the original map that you saw on the cover of that EIR, Chinese EIR, and you see the southern leg of the land bridge goes all the way down around Vietnam. It follows the coast, in other words, because this is real rough terrain, right? Through Kunming province, Thailand or whatever that is,
Yeah, that would be Vietnam.
It's real jungle, yeah. So what happened is that this must have been around this period. There was a fellow that came here from Beijing, and I was tasked to take him around New York and stuff. And I wasn't told too much about who he really was, but again, he worked for the government, and his expertise was in rail, and he was an expert in the area of southern China, Kunming province, etc. But Lainey told me afterwards what happened is that she took him down then to meet Lyndon in Virginia, and they get to talking. Of course, Lynn served in the CBI theater in the Second World War, so he knows something about the terrain and geography. And she said they got out a big map, right? Very detailed map, and they put it on the phone. They both got it on their hands and knees, and for a few hours, they were going, oh, we should go here. And they came up with the third route of the land bridge that went overland. Because this guy knew a lot about how you could actually build the rail in that terrain. So isn't that funny? And that was completed. It's difficult. So as part of this, you get in the visit of Jiang Zemin to the United States, and then the return visit by Bill Clinton to China. So this is the first visit by a president to China since Nixon, 1998. So it was clear that this was part of this whole policy initiative that LaRouche has set into motion with the Russians, with the Chinese. This is what Clinton was on the verge of adopting with his new financial architecture when the blue dress showed up. The great sucking sound. So I don't know if people remember this whole Asian crisis that occurred in 1997 with the currencies all being collapsed. Anybody remember that? It was a big thing, right? And Soros was involved, the British were involved, and they would run attacks against these currencies. It started with the Thai baht, which speculated against and drove the value of the currency down. And then it just swept Asia. And I'm bringing this up because we have been telling the Chinese, forget this London-based system. Forget it. You got to come up with something completely. And they said, oh no, forget that. LaRouche, I know you great ideas. We're going to build the land bridge, and, but this whole, he keeps saying the whole thing's going to collapse. And this really skyrocketed LaRouche's credibility in the Chinese-speaking world. That's what this guy LaRouche was saying, right?
Say away.
So the influence grew enormously.
That was Soros was
Yeah.
instrumental in destroying Malaysia.
Yes, that's right. And that's when it was a big public confrontation. And Lin was directly identified, LaRouche at that point, as being in the middle of the fight on the side of Mahathir and Malaysia, right?
What happened to the Japanese yen?
Oh, I don't know.
It wasn't affected.
I didn't hear it.
The Chinese down.
Probably not.
Bouncing around.
That was probably a protected currency.
What's the date on that?
97.
When in 97?
Well, this article's from November, so this is a Time magazine article. But I think it occurred over the summer, from what I remember.
Time magazine.
Yeah. Anyway, so LaRouche responded to this directly. Anyway, this says people first. He wrote this document. It was like one of these 1, 2, 3 protect your currency, blah blah blah. Very programmatic approach. And we got this out in the Chinese language version, and this circulated very, very widely, including in the press and stuff. And what we did is then, this is an article that I wrote, which is called Lyndon LaRouche, Sun Yat-sen, and the Coming Eurasian Land Bridge Era of Civilization. It's kind of a long title, right? But what I go through is the natural development of the land bridge and the development of the American system in China. This is like one idea, and the history of Sun Yat-sen, some of the stuff with Hawaii, etc., to give them further idea of, again, the difference between the American system LaRouche represents, that we represent, and this British imperial financial system. And then in 1997, we had a big conference here in New York City, down in Chinatown, in the basement of the Benevolent Society. We had, 200 or 300 people there, including the son of, what's his name? Adam Clayton Powell Jr., who was a city councilman.
Yeah.
He was at that meeting.
Yeah.
I think there were a couple other city councilmen there. It was not a small, it was a political thing. And the idea is we were bringing this whole Eurasian land bridge perspective, not just to the Chinese community, but into New York City, right? Of course, people that came to that meeting were harassed, to say the least. This is another issue of the newsletter where we warn about, well, is this prophetic, right? This is 1997, and we're warning about the British, that's what we're saying, is the British plot to encircle China. Xinjiang, and this is exactly what's happening. This is the Obama document. If you ever want to know a good example of Obama's policy coming directly out of London, this is it, right? Xinjiang province, that's the Uyghurs and the terrorists, the Al-Qaeda-linked terrorists who have been carrying out these horrible, terrible attacks in Western China.
You'll write them up so we spell them
Uyghurs,
more.
Uighar, something like that. This is the Asian pivot. We have the deployment of NATO. I mean, this is what we call it today, right? So we have to give them a very clear idea. There is an agenda here to bust up China, to destroy you, wake up, right? And we go through, of course, in there where it's coming from. Then we took LaRouche's economics book, so you wish to learn about economics, and we translated the whole thing into Chinese, and we printed that up, and we printed it, made it up into, it wasn't printed as a book per se. We kind of did it on our own. But then, well, I might as well talk about this now. Part of the thing that had gone on throughout all of this, so we printed this up as a book. We made up several hundred copies. Leni Rubinstein, and this is something that nobody would even know about, but throughout this entire period would have every year or sometimes twice a year would go to Taiwan for like a month or 6 weeks. And she would meet, have in-depth discussions with the top people who were the old kind of like inheritors of the tradition of Sun Yat-sen. And this went on over a series of years. And they would get things like LaRouche's economics book. And they would then spread it, right? And I'll come back to that because it's critical, because all of this process, well, I'll just mention it now. Because you had, over the last years, people may know that this whole conflict between Taiwan and mainland is almost non-existent now. There's an understanding that there's one China under one idea. And I can tell you that the people that were the best people that we met in Taiwan ended up being the official cross-straits negotiators with Beijing. So that was something we were absolutely directly involved with. Right. This is the LaRouche's 1996 campaign. No, 2000 campaign, The Road to Recovery. Anybody remember this book? No.
Yes.
It's important. This is also, we put it out in a really nice glossy version. And it's important because in this book is what Lin lays out this idea of the Survivors Club. He said the Western system is going to go. It's just a matter of time. And the Survivors Club is Russia, India, and China. These are the three powers that have to collaborate. Now, if you look at the planet today, hello, that's what's going on. You have this new election by Modi in India. Totally pro-development guy. He's going to make all sorts of deals with Russia, with China. This is supposed to be the two countries that are always fighting each other, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
it's so cool.
And it's
That's
over.
so cool.
So the issue of the Survivors Club now is where do we stand, right? But that widely circulated. This is where he talks about this is the Survivors Club in Chinese. And then, this was my first stab at putting Lin up in Chinese on the internet. This is our first little Mickey Mouse website. So I started in the late 90s. People still weren't using the internet a lot then, right? But it did start to circulate. We did start having something covered on the internet by that point.
从1919到1923年的这段期间，也就是大英帝国所精心策划的第一次世界大战的战后时期，德国新成立的威玛共和国被迫承受了一个。
Since you can't understand it, do people remember the something in 1984, the firewall? People remember that video, the firewall?
The firewall.
Firewall?
Yeah.
It goes through we put it out after the collapse in 2007.
Is this
It's a DVD. It's a
No,
little DVD.
our video.
If you don't have it, yeah, it's our DVD.
Yeah.
So we took a little section there from on how, because remember that documentary went through how the hyperinflation worked in Germany, and how this led to fascism, et cetera, and that's the process that was undergoing again in the West. Anyway, we took maybe a little 5-10 minute section of it on this Versailles hyperinflation, and we translated that and circulated that widely as a video. That was our first Chinese video. So again, along the lines of this Taiwan mainland thing, in 2007, LaRouche was invited as the keynote speaker for an organization in California. Well, it wasn't, the conference was in California. It's actually a worldwide organization for the U.S.-China relationship and peaceful reunification of China. And this was people who were diaspora Chinese here, people from Taiwan. There's Lin with the ambassador from the People's Republic of China to the United States, same conference. So this is all a discussion of unifying China, but of course under what idea? And this is something you have to just think about the whole thing that we just went through. So here you have, by the middle of the 2000s, the president of China, Hu Jintao, is a Sun Yat-sen scholar. This is in mainland China, right? And the anniversary of Sun Yat-sen's birth in 2006, he has a whole conference in Beijing on Sun Yat-sen and how this is the real father of China. He doesn't talk about Mao. Doesn't even say much. I mean, the speech is something almost we could have written. totally accurate. Sun Yat-sen in Hawaii, the three principles of the people. So here you have, 2008, 20 years after Tiananmen Square. And the power of these ideas is now what's dominating the Chinese. That's not a long time. 25 years is not that long. That's like a generation. So within a generation, you've had a complete revolution where these ideas are now dominating the Chinese-speaking world. I'll just show that. This is something I put in almost 10 years ago. So it's a lot. It's only 15 years. So that's the maglev from Shanghai to the airport.
From Shanghai to the airport.
Yeah. See that? 337 kilometers.
Kilometers per hour.
160 miles an hour.
For 30 kilometers a month.
Train's going 200 miles an hour.
Wow.
The students on the train. Yeah, the students on the train. Oh my God. Yeah, going down to the moon.
Now this is before they actually had gone to the moon. So I made this, 9 years ago, I made this little video.
That is so
Yeah. So that's their first moon rocket, the Shenzhou 1. So they launched that.
No one has a nickel rocket yet. Same as
Oh. That's Tiananmen Square.
Yeah. This child was in college when this split happened.
Anyway, and then one other thing, one of our members, Judy Hodgkinson, has a contact who's a USC professor. I believe she's 93 now, she's a world-renowned violinist. And what she does now, I guess still now, is she, in her retirement, would in the summertime return to China and teach and whatever. And she just is absolutely blown away by the transformation. So, and there's a series of articles that came out in the Western press on this. So you now have in China 40 million classical piano students, 40 million. That's larger than most countries.
40 million.
40 million Chinese kids learning the piano. 40 million.
Oh my.
And that's not that the violin, it's probably 100 million if you count all the instruments and everything else. Then you hear, this is from an article in the Toronto Globe and Mail. The numbers of young Chinese people studying piano and violin far exceed the population of Canada. Not saying much. Even the Juilliard School is planning a new location not far from Beijing, amid hopes that Chinese ears will prove hungrier for symphonic sounds than those in North America, which have left orchestras facing bankruptcy and salary cuts. That's from the Toronto Globe. And there's a whole bunch of other articles on
I
that.
wonder why.
And there's a whole boom in concert hall construction. Now every town, city wants to have, even a small city, want to have a regular full modern concert hall. So that's pretty spectacular. I just want to read this again. Can you give the closure here? The most unfailing herald, companion, and follower of the awakening of a great people to work a beneficial change in opinion or institution is poetry. At such periods, there is an accumulation of the power of communicating and imparting intense and impassioned conceptions respecting man and nature. The person in whom this power resides may often, as regards many portions of their nature, have little apparent correspondence with that spirit of good of which they are the ministers. But even whilst they deny and abjure, they are yet compelled to serve that power which is seated upon the throne of their own soul. So, power of reason.